Before we go anywhere else, I'm going to rant and rave for another couple minutes. And there's people out there in Twitter land that are going to say, oh, yeah, the old man yells at the cloud again. He's so angry and old and behind the times. And, obviously 40 years experience in doing something doesn't matter to people who know what's going on. But there were even more comments still on Twitter. Remember, I trended because I was a racist because I knocked old Satchel reckless work. And, the only possible reason for that because she's black, not because she's about to kill this other girl.
And you made me look up that term, and you didn't make me, but I ended up doing it because I'd never heard it before. Snatch you bald-headed, and it's an old an old New England term that was used.
How did Mama Cornette get it? She never visited New England. But anyway, nevertheless, the point is the root of this thing is there's people out there that tell me and/or Road Dogg and/or Gerald Briscoe and/or Mike Mondo and/or people who've been doing this for 20 and 30 and 40, in Jerry's case, 60 fucking years. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. They agreed to it. They were working stiff. Not only do the fans not know what working stiff means anymore, most of the wrestlers don't. They think, I guess, working stiff means reckless and dangerous and being lackluster and frivolous with your opponent's body and or yours. And it comes down, I think, to not only how easy it is to get in the wrestling business these days, but how people are trained. And, we've talked about it's not a joke and it's not a knock. I'm telling the truth because they admit it. A lot of the indie talent did the Hardy Boy thing. They became the poster boys for let's get on a trampoline in our backyard and train ourselves. And they forget that then the Hardys, once they finished with that, they still fucking had to work with veterans to get ahead once they got in the real wrestling business. And they had to learn things, even though potentially they, well, let's face it, the Hardys are patient zero for a lot of this stuff, but they were the innovators and they got away with it. But now everybody thinks they can do it. But go ahead. What were you going to say?
I'm thinking about this as you're talking about it, and I think for a certain style with the Hardys, you're right. But what I was going to ask you, because it kind of predates anyone knowing the Hardys. I mean, they were doing job matches for you on TV tapings for Smoky Mountain, but was it Smoky Mountain where you first started seeing wrestlers that were influenced by the stiff style that they were seeing on videotapes from Japan?
Well, no, not really in the Smoky Mountain area.
Beyond the high flying, but the actual, the All Japan matches where they were laying stuff in, and even a lot of the New Japan matches, actually.
Yeah, well, and actually, except for when Bobby Fulton and Tommy Rogers, and later on Bobby and Jackie Fulton a couple of times, would go to Japan, they'd come back and either the Midnight Express or the Bodies would be like, Jesus Christ, it's going to take another 2 weeks to calm them down and get them to start working again.
What did Ricky and Robert tell you about when they went to All Japan?
God, what year was that?
I think it was 88. I think it was the year they left.
Yeah, see, I wasn't around them then when they came back because they had left Crockett. But that must have been a fucking culture shock for both sides. And everything's context, but nevertheless, the point is that the fans are learning on the internet now what they think about wrestling, not from the era of Gerald Briscoe or the era of me or even the era of a Mike Mondo from 20 years ago in OVW. They're learning from the current indie wrestlers, the self-trained guys or the guys that are trained by people with the same level of experience at the same age. They're all being taught to do moves and that this is show business. And guys think nothing of now if they show up at an indie show, oh, you're going to work with the Invisible Man. Cool. I'll get to do some fun stuff. That's what's led to what we've got for wrestling these days. And the reason this came up in my mind, and it was a long, convoluted thought process, as mine usually are, but I was doing some research on the Graham brothers, and I'd known this before because I read the book before, but it had slipped my mind that Dr. Jerry Graham was actually trained and broken in the business by Jim Londos, because Graham was from Phoenix and Londos retired to Phoenix. And that was amazing to me because here, Jerry Graham, who would later on become an innovator and a pioneer in tag team wrestling and wrestling heel psychology and television promos when they were new and all that shit. That's the way that the Graham family dynasty started, was trained by a guy who never did television because it didn't exist when he was the biggest box office attraction in wrestling, and would have probably from the 30s would have been pretty straight on high spots and everything too, right? But Jerry Graham became one of the great psychologists in wrestling because he was trained by a guy that had worked with all the best and had been there in the pioneer days when they developed the psychology behind wrestling. And every succeeding generation, we lose more of what this business is about, was about, should be about, and going more into this, I don't know, fucking performance art phase that they've got going now that is appealing to fewer people than ever before in the history of wrestling. And you can't say that, well, you know, things evolve and things go out of style and whatever. Baseball didn't, football didn't, basketball didn't. Wrestling was bigger than all of those things. And it's the only professional sport that is dovetailed in popularity and in mainstream acceptance. And it's because of the way that the current performers think about the business, and the fact that I think that it's so easy. Anybody with money to spend can be in the wrestling business now because there's a wrestling school on every corner. Somebody's going to train somebody. There's outlaw shows you can just walk up on and say, hey, yeah, let me be on it. And so none of the people in the business respect it or had to put in. They're talking about paying their dues because they've got to go work independent shows for $10 or no money or $20 or a hot dog or whatever and take all these bumps. Well, you don't have to take all those fucking bumps. You're just doing it on purpose. You didn't sell any tickets or you wouldn't be making $10. And that mindset with these people is why now it's a complete rib. The marks are in the ring. Everybody's destroying their body, and the people in the audience are laughing at it. Whereas in every previous generation up until 25 years ago, the guys in the ring were safe, and the people in the seats were screaming because they thought they were all getting killed.
Now they get killed and everyone sits on their hands, and then they get taken away and everyone will clap, you know, when they stick their thumb in the air.
And when somebody does get knocked out for real, then everybody's all concerned, like, oh gosh, well, why were you chanting, we want tables in a girls' match 5 minutes ago if you didn't want one of those girls to be fucking paralyzed? But see, that's the thing. And training.
Yeah, this is the end result of that. That's what I was going to say. It's the end result of the era when people watched a lot of tapes and just wanted to copy things they saw, and anyone could open a wrestling school.
Yes. And training used to be about how to think about the business and how to react to things. You always had a situation where it was made as hard as possible for a guy to get into business. They didn't just open up to everybody. They wanted to make sure people were serious. Yes, it's a little excessive to break Hulk Hogan's ankle in his first workout, but he was serious enough to come back. But everybody got stretched. Here's the thing. The reason why I always liked Tennessee wrestling was because Tennessee was the last territory with a direct link to the pioneers of wrestling. Roy Welch was a wrestler in the 1920s, and he was in charge of the territory until the mid-70s. And then Jerry Jarrett took over, and he was in charge until 1997. Two men had control of a large geographic area of the wrestling business for almost 60 years between the two of them. And the style and the psychology and the lessons that were passed down from the pioneers of this thing were personal issues, draw money, conflict between two guys, make the people believe the animosity is real. It's how you react to things. And training used to be, when advanced training happened in the ring in front of people. Regular training might not even go on in a ring. Ric Flair trained Stan Lane in his backyard. Stan would come down to Charlotte from Greensboro, go to Flair's house. He always had a gym or gym equipment in his house. They'd work out. They'd run, the roads in the neighborhood, do road work, and then they'd work on holds and reversals. Same thing happened in barns. Vern Gagne's barn. Maybe they got in a ring once in a while, but it was, okay, I'll grab you in a headlock. Now you grab my wrists and you turn left and stand up, and the veteran would put himself in a top wrist lock. Now I'm going to fucking duck through and reverse it. I got you in a hammer lock. You scream, see? They'd crank up on it a little bit, let you know what it felt like. You would go through simple, basic holds and reversals and how to take a flat back bump and things like that. And then you would actually learn in the ring with a veteran in the opening match somewhere, where they would tell you every move to make and put themselves in holds for you. And they would tell you, listen to the people, hear how they react, watch when I do this. And even in OVW, when we trained guys, yes, you told them how to do the moves and then taught them how to take bumps safely. And here's a high spot, one tackle, drop down, hip toss, kickoff, get it again. But I spent more time with the guys, especially the advanced class, on reactions, the emotion that you showed, the facials, the attitude you had, body language, what is happening to you and how do you react to it naturally. And that's the same thing that the veterans would teach young guys how to think about wrestling. It wasn't you do this move now, and boy, this move, and they'll really pop. It was like, okay, it's too early to beat the babyface. The people will lose faith in him. He's got to win that match, but we'll get some heat afterwards. Or this is the one where the babyface needs to win, or the people will lose faith in him. So he's got to win this match. Some people say wins and losses don't matter. If you're a job guy and you're just there to put people over, no, it doesn't. And if it's a cold match just on the card underneath, probably doesn't. But the most important thing about wrestling is wins and losses when you're either pushing somebody to get them over or you're conducting a program. The veterans would teach you that. If you beat the fucking heel now, you'll take his heat away. Or it's not time for a fucking comeback on the babyface, whatever. That was the psychology. And the training was more about protecting the business, respecting the business, how to think about it, and how to logically get yourself over, rather than, oh, we're going to do all these moves and it's going to be a 4-star match, which, as we all know, didn't exist. And Danny Davis, he was on the program years ago. Here, I guess people can look it up. But he started by answering an ad in the Jackson, Tennessee newspaper. If you want to be a wrestler, come to the Jackson Coliseum at 11 o'clock Sunday morning. And there were all kinds of people standing out there in the parking lot. And that was in 1978. That's when Buddy Fuller had started training guys on his farm in Bolivar. And out of like 12 that were picked, Danny Davis was one of 2 that were left he was the smallest guy, and he was one of 2 that were left at the end of the thing. And the other guy wrestled for a few months. Danny had a 15-year wrestling career and ran his own business for 25 years, and it was the most successful wrestling training program, maybe of all time and certainly of modern times. But the way he learned, he had this nice facility here in Louisville with air conditioning, finally, the last building we got, and a ring and TV lights and all that stuff. He was trained by Buddy Fuller and that Terry Sawyer, who was an amateur shooter, on Buddy's farm in Bolivar, and he paid Buddy in order to do farm work all day and then get stretched in a barn that night, because the old timers would stretch you. And it wasn't float overs and collegiate wrestling. It was the old carny shit and hooking, as Luthez used to term it, the title of his book, Hooker. Those were the guys that were more dangerous than the shooters, the hookers. They could rip your shit out without thinking about it. Adrian Street was somewhat of a hooker. I said one time he could grab your dick and beat you over the head with it while he ate dinner with the other hand. And that's what they would do. And the same thing happened to David Schultz. It's in his book. Only it wasn't Buddy Fuller. It was Buddy's uncle, Herb Welch. At his farm in Dyersburg, the Welches always had land out in Dyersburg. Roy Welch had a second house out there in addition to his place in Nashville. As a matter of fact, he had a second wife out there in Dyersburg in addition to his wife in Nashville. That's a different story. But they took David Schultz in the fucking barn and stretched him and rubbed the skin off his face and beat on him. And I saw David Schultz as a rookie, and he was still 6'5" and 230 pounds easy. And that 60-something-year-old Herb Welch tortured him to the point where when he'd get home at night, he couldn't get out of his own car, and his wife was begging him to quit. But when they persevered, they had a respect for the business. It wasn't paying your dues, riding up and down the road, working a outlaw match for $10. It was to get in the business, to learn the secrets. And finally, after Danny had been stretched for several weeks in a row, he bowed up because Danny's fucking full of piss. And he said, I want to do the shit they do on television. And that's when they put their arm around him and said, okay, here's what goes on. You had to prove that you were serious before you were allowed in the brotherhood and exposed to the secrets. And by that, you learned a respect for what was going on. If you jacked off, said the wrong thing, were frivolous with the information, it affected everybody's income. Everybody was paid on the gates. More tickets sold, more money for everybody. Fewer tickets sold, less money for everybody. If you did something to harm the business, make it look phony or bullshit, the other guys would take care of you because you were taking money out of their fucking mouth and their families. And there was a level, because of all that, of respect for the knowledge you had and the people that had let you into their deal, this thing of ours. And you learned because they knew they had been doing it for years. And, I'm always fascinated by things that I saw in wrestling. I was like, how did that develop? Was that the first guy that came up with that? I've mentioned this to you before. That thing that Dorian Terry Funk used to do, that nobody else I ever saw do this move. Where a guy would back him up into the ropes, and they would grab the guy and they'd stick their leg in between his legs, and they'd jump up on the top rope and they would flip over backwards and throw the guy right over the top of him. Slick looking move. And then I was watching a tape of the Graham brothers, Jerry and Eddie from Capitol Wrestling in 1958. They're doing the same move. I said, wait, how could the Funks stole it? Well, maybe because the Funks worked for Eddie Graham. Then I remembered Eddie Graham, his first major territory and what put him on top was working Amarillo for Dory Funk Sr. I bet you he learned it from him because he learned a lot of booking from him. And then you go back further when I look at the reference book that Scott Teal did on Amarillo wrestling. Roy Welch was wrestling in Amarillo in 1930. And at that point in time, the original Dutch Mantel, not today's Dutch, but the original Dutch Mantel that he was named after, was the top wrestler in Amarillo. And you read and see that they're doing some of the same kind of angles and the same kind of things that you would have seen in Texas in the 50s, or in Florida in the 70s, or in Tennessee for a 40-year period. And it's amazing the link that you can draw to the people that started this business that basically by trial and error understood that they had the power to manipulate people's emotions to where they could cause riots or cause celebrations in the streets if they just applied themselves to getting their issue over and drawing the people into it. It wasn't about whacking each other over the head with chairs. It was about making the people come to see you whack each other over the head with chairs because you hate each other so bad, or because there's such an important championship on the line, or whatever. It was motivating people to buy into what you were doing, to get invested in the program, not by hospitalizing yourself by going too far because everybody now knows it's all bullshit. So that's each successive generation, it's not only become easier to become involved in the wrestling business, but it's also the standards have been lower as far as what guys are allowed to do once that they get in it. And now they can just do anything they fucking want. Whether it's a preliminary guy stealing a show from the main event guy or whatever the fuck. And that's why it's all just a constant barrage of motion and meaningless scripted chatter. And occasionally somebody can make you slow down and listen like an MJF or a Punk because they sound like they mean what they say. But otherwise, we've lost the whole meaning of this thing that existed for 100+ years in fine form until everybody decided they could do it better about 20 years ago. And the outside forces got involved and said, oh, shit, we need to get other people watching wrestling besides wrestling fans. So we'll make the wrestling program so fucking intolerable for the wrestling fans that all these other people are going to be the only ones watching. And one more thing. Remember the story? Well, it's not a story. It was a fact. It happened. Mario Galento attacking Jerry Jarrett on Live Memphis TV. It was recounted a couple of weeks ago on Tales from the Territories. It's been a topic of conversation around wrestling in Tennessee for 50 years. And we found out a new detail. Jerry Jarrett said he actually did pull Mario Galento's eyeball out and throw it on the ground, which
that would have been.
Well, that would have been difficult because Mario only had one good eye to begin with, and that would have been it at that point in time. So I don't doubt he went for the eye, and they'd already busted him open and etc., but the eyeball didn't leave. But the point is, Jerry Jarrett credited a guy named Sailor Moran with teaching him how to shoot and take care of himself. And if you go back and look at this Amarillo lineup from 1930, guess who Roy Welch is wrestling? Sailor Moran. That guy was a legitimate motherfucker too, and he was one of Roy Welch's old cronies. And when Roy took a liking to Jerry Jarrett as a 20-something-year-old kid, he had never even been a wrestler. They broke him in as a referee, but he was booking Memphis before he even became a wrestler. And the old-timers resented him. And so before they put him in the ring, Roy Welch had his old crony Sailor Moran teach him, say, hey, these guys are going to fuck with you because of who you are and because, you know, I put you in this position. So here, this guy will teach you all the shit you need to do to take care of yourself in a pinch. And this was in the late 60s. It still went on in the business. But you know, that's why the old timers, they could never fully let their guard down if they were anybody important because somebody might try to make a name off of them. So they knew how to take care of themselves in a pinch with shit that was not necessarily allowed in collegiate competition. But that's where this business came from, at the grassroots level. Gathering a crowd and convincing them that two guys were mad at each other and there's going to be a fight. And say what you want, technology has changed. Now, instead of in the carnival, they can have it on worldwide pay-per-view. But human emotions have not changed. If they buy into something and they believe in it, they're going to invest more of their time and emotion and effort. And if they think it's all bullshit, they're going to watch it for free or get a giggle out of it and then move on. And that's where we have now turned wrestling into something that people watch and get a giggle out of for free and move on. Except for the last vestiges of those 25 million people that used to buy a ticket every year in the 60s and 70s is now down to about 2 million that'll watch television and still can't get over it. But there you have that.